Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Well Dwellers podcast. My name's Eric Freiberger, and I'm coming to you today from Treaty 7 lands, Calgary, Alberta. It is sunny. It is beautiful. I cannot wait to get outside, maybe a little later, to do some wheeling along the streets. You know, here in the Well, I would like to say that clarity often emerges when we are willing to sift our muddy thoughts through our relationships with others. I love nothing more than joining a friend at the local coffee shop and chatting, talking about what's on our hearts and just hearing each other's stories. It is by sharing our life stories with others that new truths can be revealed. These are stories that refuse to be abstractions, but begin with real bodies, limits, time, dependence, and hope that has learned to live with fragility. My guest today, Richard Beck, focuses his work and stories more often than not, naming the powers that shape human fear and desire, and also gesture toward a joy that is not naive, triumphal, or ableist. Building off of this, my key framing for today's conversation, I'm hoping, is exploring the question, if the church is often discipled more by fear than by love, how might disability expose this formation and invite another way? Probably pretty key for today's atmosphere as well. I met Richard several years ago while working on completing my master's degree through Rochester University with my professor and friend, Dr. Mark Love. And he left Richard Beck left a very impressionable memory on me after asking a very revealing question in my journey of liminal experience within church and ministry in my adventure with house churches at the time. He has written several books, including Unclean Meditations on Purity, Hospitality, and Mortality, The Slavery of Death, The Shape of Joy, The Transformative Power of Moving Beyond Yourself, and several others, including his latest publication, The Book of Love, A Better Way to Read the Bible, which I look forward to reading as well. So, welcome to the Well, Richard Beck. Thanks for joining me today.
Excited to be with you, Eric. Yeah, really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So I suppose a lot has happened in the last 10 years since we first met in, I think it was Charlottesville in 2014. What's perhaps something new in life for you today?
Well, here at ACU, I'm still at Abilene Christian University as a psychology professor. And probably the biggest change is last time we met, I was the chair of the psychology department. But after 18 years of serving doing that, I've stepped away from that. And there's a new center here called the Saunders Center for Joy and Human Flourishing. And so I'm the senior fellow for that. And so I've been involved in that work. You mentioned my book, The Shape of Joy. Part of that project, and the Book of Love is coming out of that as well. So, yeah, being part of that conversation about joy and flourishing, what that looks like for our campus, and obviously a culture where joy seems to be a very scarce and fragile thing.
Yeah, I've been seeing that word a lot lately, flourishing. Why do you think flourishing is becoming such a popular word today?
Some of it is due to the rise of what's called positive psychology, at least in my field, and how that's kind of trickled out in wellness culture. About like the last 30 years, psychologists have turned away from what they would call like a disease model, a focus on mental illness and its treatment, to focusing on, the good life or flourishing. The Greek word that psychologists turn to is from Aristotle, called eudaimonia, the life well lived, but a lot of people just translate it as flourishing. And so instead of turning towards a conversation about like the pleasant or the pleasurable life, hedonic well-being, there's this interest in eudaimonic well-being, the good life, the meaningful life, the rich life. And so the word that I think people have, landed on is flourishing, to kind of get at that idea.
Yeah, I'm still kind of warming up to it. I'm a little fearful that flourishing might end up kind of along the lines of missional, where it gets twisted into things it's not.
Yeah, and I do think there's a trap in American wellness culture where we're always kind of addicted to forms of optimization and maximization, that flourishing becomes co-opted by a kind of the American kind of success ethos. So I do think the Christian tradition, given, the cruciform aspects of the faith, help nuance overly optimistic or triumphalistic visions of what flourishing can be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're really diving. This is so typical for me, Richard. I dive in deep right away. I'm like Peter in the boat. I'm not waiting for the boat. I'm jumping in.
Okay, super.
Anyways, one thing I've really wanted to talk to you about for a long time was when I read your book, The Slavery of Death. I read it during a really kind of darkish time of my life. I had just lost some significant people in my life, and I had a lot of questions around death. So particularly one of the themes that you spoke in there was of the anti-trinity when you spoke of Satan, sin, and death. So I thought we'd turn there first. In the first chapter, you identify humanity saying, as mortal creatures separated from God's vivifying spirit, humans are fearful and survival-driven animals, easily drawn into sinful and selfish practices. Because we are mortal and driven by self-preservation, our survival instinct makes us tragically vulnerable to death anxiety, the desire to preserve our own existence above all else and at all costs. The theme carries throughout, I think, on a lot of your writing, where fear of death holds humanity in a sort of bondage. Human disability often lives in constant proximity to these issues and realities of medicalization, risk, and mortality as well. How does this fear get baptized in kind of a religious language, especially in churches that equate blessing with health, productivity, and independence? How does it manage to creep into our theology and church culture?
Yeah, the idea there in that book, The Slavery of Death, is to just kind of rethink maybe some old ways of thinking about what's the problem with human existence. And so I'm reframing some discussions about where human sin comes from, and how a lot of us grew up in Christian contexts where the problem with us is that we're congenitally wicked or born evil, original sin or total depravity. But that if you look at other scriptures where like Satan is described as the one who holds the power of death, and that we are enslaved by the fear of death our entire lives. That's Hebrews chapter 2. I put, therefore, less a total depravity at the heart of the human predicament, and more an anxiety, survival-based fears, that we're selfish not because we're depraved. We're selfish because we're finite creatures, and we want to protect ourselves from death, from illness, from disease or damage or decay. But what happens to your question is, sometimes, like you see this, especially in like the prosperity gospel, there is a sense where our fear becomes baptized or sacralized because God becomes, and prosperity becomes the means to protect us from our neediness and our vulnerability. And so religion, in many ways, becomes just another form of a defense mechanism in a culture that is characterized by a great deal of death avoidance.
Yeah. So you mentioned a bit about sin. You mentioned a bit about death as well. I know this fits into that kind of anti-trinity. I guess you talked a bit about Satan too. And I want to talk a bit about all of these kind of in different, in focusing on each one of them. But I might ask you also, how can we see this triad function psychologically and perhaps physically, spiritually, in kind of the everyday life? How do we see it manifest?
Yeah. So I've described three things there. When you look at Hebrews, you got the unholy trinity. You have death, And that death creates anxiety, and that anxiety is used by Satan to create sin. So it's all kind of connected in this cycle. And I don't really need anybody to uh, adopt a really supernatural view of this dynamic, because one of the things I think that is fresh about this approach of putting death anxiety at the heart of the human predicament is there are very non-theistic, non-supernatural ways to think about that. I think a lot of, you from a very materialistic, even Darwinian perspective, just say, yeah, of course, the survival anxiety drives human psychology. So obviously Christians think more's going on than just a survival instinct, but minimally, that's what's going on. As creatures prone to entropy and decay, we try to resist that and fight against that. And that can be done in a healthy way, or it can be done in a deeply delusional or neurotic way, to the point I was describing earlier. And religion can help us deal with these anxieties in a healthy way, but religion can also be used in a very neurotic and defensive way. So how does it affect daily life in a practical sense? Well, in the book, I talk about how there are really kind of two kinds of death anxiety, which psychologists describe as basic anxiety and neurotic anxiety. So by basic anxiety, we see people engage in self-interested or selfish behavior when they try to hoard resources.
Mhm.
So why might we be concerned about like immigration? Well, we might be concerned about immigration because we're concerned of scarce resources being soaked up. And if they soak up those resources, then that'll affect my ability to take care of my livelihood. So literally paying the bills, getting good jobs, the safety of our streets. Those are examples of basic survival resource anxiety. And so when you see people experience scarcity there, they become less charitable, less generous. The neurotic anxiety is a little bit more existential. This is the way death threatens our meaning-making structures. So this is like what you'll see in like Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity. Everything is meaningless because we all kind of tend towards death. And so a lot of us engage in what I would call borrowing from Ernest Becker, the psychologist, hero games or hero projects. We construct for ourselves a way to live a significant or a meaningful life, and anything that threatens that, those meaning making or heroic structures, we can become defensive about those things as well. So that's more of a self-esteem driven anxiety. So there is a survival based resource scarcity that can affect our moral behavior. But there's also this more neurotic self-esteem, self-image, hero project that can be threatened as well. And that's more the neurotic aspect of death anxiety. So those are some examples there. How are you constructing your identity and your meaning and what threatens it? And also just where do you experience scarcities in your life from a resource sense, and where might that be affecting your generosity towards others? And so those are two examples of where we see the way anxiety pulls kind of some moral strings on us.
Yeah, I'm seeing how those can play into some of the systemic issues as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. Particularly from a personal perspective and from being part of the disabled community. Well, in one sense, when you talked about death, I really appreciated how you kind of opened it up to saying it's not just a one-time event. It's this, you experience small deaths along the way. And it's in navigating those deaths, accepting as part of the finite sense of your being. I think I really appreciated that from a disabled perspective, and saying it's okay to embrace death as part of being human. But it also, I think, shows a bit of, I guess the question I'm trying to frame is, how do you see disability functioning as a kind of truth teller or even gift within what you call the slavery of death, maybe revealing the lies we tell ourselves about control, normalcy, and worth, how we encounter disability as a light upon that.
So I'll go back to my earlier book, the one that I wrote before the slavery of death, called Unclean. And one of the things I make in Unclean, the points I make in Unclean, is that because American culture is characterized by kind of a death denial or a death avoidance, that we have a tendency to shove away or marginalize reminders of human limitation and human finitude. And because of that, we become radically inhospitable to bodies or lives or experiences that bring the finitude into view. And so obviously disability is an example of that, but we can also look at mental illness. We can also look at the poor. We can look at the elderly as locations where where the human predicament comes into view. And so instead we opt for Disney-like illusions of perpetual success, perpetual youthfulness. And so American society kind of lives with a false image of human existence. And so when you speak of truth telling or even a prophetic utterance, I think people who bring the full range of human experience into view, burst that illusion and bring a degree of authenticity and truthfulness into consciousness. That's something needed in our culture. An American culture is characterized by kind of an avoidance of our neediness and avoidance of our vulnerabilities, but it's also characterized by an American church that has been kind of, like you described, kind of sacralizes that American vision of youthfulness and success.
Yeah. Just for clarity, I think we can say it's Canadian too. There's a Canadian church that also does the same. And I think I've been really confronted with it a lot lately. There's this fear of connecting with the marginalized groups, particularly certain groups. And rather than being open to the framework of advocacy that Mark Love talked about a week and a bit ago, they alienate and disassociate, basically make invisible all marginal groups in the fear of intersection. It's a thing that's going on across North America, I think, maybe even across the world.
Yep.
I know my friend Ty Reagan, he also talks a lot about the cult of normalcy. Thomas Reynolds speaks of it as a theological distortion or undermines human dignity. Disability theology also tries to resist a narrative of normalcy or the accusation of being abnormal, which frames disabled lives as problems to be solved rather than gifts to be received. That I think that's also part of the fear in the church. So in looking at the character of Satan, you describe him not primarily as a monster, but as an accuser. How does this lens help us understand ableism as a moral and spiritual practice of accusation, sorting bodies into worthy and unworthy categories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a deep question. Yeah, I think if we kind of lean into, Satan in the Hebrew means, opponent or antagonist, but diablos, devil, in the New Testament means, accusation. And Satan is described as the one who kind of points a finger of accusation. So yes, when we put up standards of normalcy, we're always framing disability not as a gift, but rather as a deficit, and I think there's even discourse. Again, I'm no expert in disability theology, but there's even discourse in trying to wrestle with the word disabled as a word of contrast, not as something generative on its own, but always in a contrasting kind of way. And so thus there is an implicit sense of a life that is less than, or a life that is failed or suboptimal. And I think that is constantly rumbling in that background of how to think about ability or disability. And if we're not careful, then yes, we are engaging in a diabolical discourse of ableism, where ableism is considered the standard. So like in a moral sense, here's this moral purity, and anything that falls away from that is considered to be sinful or broken. In a similar way, ableism is a diabolical discourse in the sense that it has a standard of purity or a standard of attainment, and anything that fails to reach that is considered to be a failure.
Mm-hmm. I personally have experienced and recognized how defining disability has been a difficulty not only in my own life, but in the social sense. I know a lot of my friends now, they won't write disabled, they'll write DIS/abled and project it that way. And I've even asked that question, is the word disabled redeemable, or do we need something new? Because language always fails and it needs to evolve. I would say right now, I think we need to find a way to redeem the term and understanding of disabled. We can't just lose it entirely. When it finds its way into policies, into law, and into agencies and such, how does the accuser manage to take that understanding and embed himself into those laws and policies? And I think it's not restricted from the church either. How does he manage to embed himself in that? Is there a defense to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're going for, but one thing that comes to mind is the way it's all fairly hidden. So laws and policies typically enshrine assumptions into structures, and because it's assumed, or like ableism is assumed, or policies that create marginalization, they're working with background assumptions that typically are not questioned. Like years ago, when I was talking about ableism and disability in one of my classes, I was in a very old building in my department that one of the desolations of that building was it was not accessible, wheelchair accessible. And I brought my students outside, and I had them look at the building, because there wasn't an entry level floor nor a ramp. There were just stairs to get into our department. Not many stairs, like 6, but stairs. And I had them. I literally pulled them out of the building. We stood on the lawn and we stared at the building. I go, "What do you guys see about this building? Is there anything problematic with it?" And they would just stared at it and stared at it and stared at it and stared at it. And they just couldn't see it. And then finally I said, if you were a student who wanted to come to our class, could they enter the building if they were in a wheelchair? And then they saw it. And I think that's part of the accuser's work. Satan is often described as the father of lies or deception. So it's not necessarily even something overt. Kind of, somebody's like, if they see a disability or difference on the street, the Satan isn't like a person who's going to like heckle or jeer, or that's not the way it manifests. It tends to manifest in not in verbal hostility, but blindness, that assumptions that obviously the disabled community bump into these structural assumptions all the time. Like what bodies were in view here that made this reasonable? And the answer is, well, not my body, clearly. And it's so to me, I would kind of push us in that direction here and kind of say sometimes the Satan's accusation is in that unspoken air we breathe, and less in toxic verbal discourse online, because that's easy to call out. Overt wickedness is easy to call out. What's harder to call out are the invisible assumptions that rank bodies in a hierarchy of worth or consideration.
Yeah. I'm sort of picturing it in some of the language I am picking up in The Shape of Joy, that inward and outward connection. And I think that's one of the things as a disabled person I'm struggling with is, while I recognize the importance and need to define disability and to hold it loosely, to hold it relationally in the outward curve that you talk about, a lot of agencies, a lot of churches, government representatives, rather than returning that same kind of outward relational sense of understanding to explore that definition and allow it to shape policies and accessibilities and social culture, they turn it inwards. And it's, what do we know about disability, and how do we take what we have heard in past, the old language, the old historical, cultural, theological, and use that to shape our policies rather than engaging in the outward relational roots of current disabled life.
Yeah. I think that's good.
Yeah. So, moving into sin and your talk in the book on sin, you write, sin might not be intrinsic, but it's inevitable. And death always follows as the consequence. In essence, sin is not just what we do, it's the condition we are trapped within. And I often picture this and talk to my friends and community about the John 9 experience of the disciples asking, why is this man born blind? Is it because he sinned or his parents sinned? And Jesus very clearly says to them, it's not that this man sinned or his parents, it's so that you might see the glory of God. He doesn't necessarily dismiss sin's presence or sin's in the relationships we have, but rather he sets it aside and puts the focus on the work and the glory of God in the man's life and in the community that's around this man's life. So what I'm wondering is, how does this reframing help disabled people who have internalized a sense of blame or shame, believing their bodies or minds or spirits are failures, which I know I've encountered a lot within disabled relationships. What did I do to deserve this type?
Yeah, because that's you're getting at kind of one of the things I'm trying to flip around in the book about kind of rethinking where the predicament lies, and a lot of Protestant framings of the fall tend to focus on more moral culpability, and so it's a very moralized worldview, which is prone to lots of distortions. Guilt, self-loathing, shame, or as you're describing, blaming oneself for a problem, seeking a moral story. Where in the book, I'm pulling from other Christian traditions. A lot of them go back to the church fathers, what's called the Christus Victor way of thinking about things. And it's just kind of saying, that what we inherit from Adam and Eve isn't the moral culpability, isn't a sense of intrinsic blameworthiness. What we inherit from Adam and Eve is finitude itself, the condition that we all find ourselves in as creatures subject to the forces of death and disease and damage and decay and disability. We are all surrounded by those entropic forces. And consequently, as survival-driven creatures, we seek in a self-interested way to protect ourselves from those forces. And so we cling and we grasp and we go to war and we build walls and we hoard our resources over against the claims of other peoples. And so that's when I describe sin as kind of being inevitable, that we're drawn into self-interest, not because of, again, a moral taint or stain upon the soul, but we are, again, kind of acting upon a survival instinct that draws us into self-interest. And that self-interest draws us away from God into selfishness and into hostility toward out-group members. So back to the conversation about disability. So the disabled person it's not a moral condition. There's no moral blame, but they are definitely encountering their finitude and the limitations of their bodies and need to navigate life given those limitations. But that is just one particular example of how the whole human species is trying to manage our finitude in ways that still can experience life as a positive good. And that's a struggle, obviously, when finitude tips into pain and suffering. But in many ways, that is the human predicament at that moment. How to deal with life as it is in all of its desolations and dissatisfactions. Not in a sense that we are to blame for that, but it's just there's kind of a givenness there, and that's kind of what you see in a book like Ecclesiastes. There isn't nobody's being blamed in Ecclesiastes. Finitude and death is just kind of a given, and presents itself as a moral challenge to be confronted, rather than something that we're being blamed for or cursed with.
So would you say that disability in a person's life is both blessing and curse all at the same time? And we experience them in I want to say broad, but the endurance of life. I don't know if that's the right word.
No, yeah. No, I think it is a particular, maybe even an acute example of what human existence is like, broadly speaking. And again, this is a universal phenomenon, but this goes to like Albert Camus in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, and where he's trying to struggle with the futility of existence because he's an existentialist. He doesn't really believe in life after death. He doesn't believe in any sort of cosmic destiny. And so he's trying to struggle with what makes life worth living. And obviously, if you are living a great life, if you're wealthy and able-bodied and charismatic and beautiful and talented, then yeah, life is a positive win for you. But when life is a struggle, or when we've experienced not just disability, but maybe abuse or trauma, then and the question of like whether or not life is good. So we're kind of bumping up against the question of theodicy. When life isn't at its fullest or best, can we name our existence as a positive good, or is it accursed? And I think disability, the experience of disability, sits at that question: is this life cursed, or can I see it also as a positive good? And what resources do I have that move me toward one answer or toward the other? Disability is the only location where that question is asked or answered, but it is one of those locations. I would assume. Again, I'm not speaking as a disabled person, but my sense of walking alongside friends that have had disability, they're posed that question every day: is this a cursed life, or is this a blessed life? And how do I dance between the sunlight and the shadows of that mixed experience?
I might have to steal that. That was good. How do I dance between the sunlight and the shadows? That was good. Do I have rights to take that, Richard?
Yes, yeah, you have free. We are always borrowing from each other.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. I was having thoughts in the back of my head there. I just finished reading a couple days ago your remarks in Shape of Joy about being Elon Musk or one of the normal people, where you said most of us think Elon Musk is the target goal for legacy, but that's good. Talking about endurance and longevity, you make a powerful statement saying Jesus rejects an identity grounded in gaining, and Paul rejects an identity rooted in grasping. We talk about, the idea of kenosis. Salvation is found in losing, to Jesus' term, and emptying in Paul's, both pointing to a death that leads to life. As a disabled person myself, I so often resist the church's preference for quick testimony and visible victory. The miraculous evidence so many want to see, or even an ideological expectation of resurrected form. The idea of, won't it be great when you get to heaven and you can run in the fields free on your own two legs, drives me nuts, Richard. I just want to throw something when I hear that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But, in the slavery of death, how might the slavery of death help us think about endurance, time, and hope when healing narratives and ideologies begin to fall apart? When I begin asking, I've been praying for healing for years. I have pursued it. I have worked out like an Olympic athlete, and yet I'm still stuck on bed rest or in a wheelchair. Yeah, how can we reframe that endurance and time?
Yeah. Well, and that kind of goes back to what I said earlier, because one person listening to my conversation about the human predicament being finitude and futility and death, some listeners might say, well, there's a Christian answer for that, and we call that heaven. And so we just kind of make a quick move toward the resurrection. And I want to be clear, I believe in heaven. I think eschatology and hope are critical to sustaining endurance. It's hard to endure if you have no hope. And it's hard to have hope if there isn't anything hopeful to look forward to. So I do think there is a metaphysical aspect to hope that we would use the word heaven to point towards. Okay.
Hmm.
But that can be done so quickly, like you're describing. People rush towards heaven, the resurrected body for somebody who's dealing with disability, or if they're dealing with like a tragic bereavement, like the death of a child, people will quickly reach towards where you're going to see your child in heaven. And so we do want to get to that good eschatological outcome, to the good news, without questioning whether or not that move might in itself be an unwillingness to sit with or tolerate ambiguity, pain, and suffering, and the fruits and the gifts that sitting with suffering and the virtues that are acquired through that experience by kind of neurotically or even defensively rushing always towards our happy endings. So let me pivot away from disability and like talk about something like depression. Like I said, psychology has focused a great deal on the disease model. And so we've seen depression described over the last few generations as a disease state. And what's interesting is that rates of depression began, as far as diagnostically speaking, have been going up right around the time where we saw the discovery of Prozac. And so now we have a pill that can help eradicate sadness from our lives. But it raises a question, like, how does human experience change, and maybe not for the better, if we eradicate sadness? Like, what virtues or capacities, what depth, what wisdom is lost if we can chemically eradicate sad feelings from the human experience? And we consider all of those experiences as sadness, as disease states and pathology. But the point being is, I think if we never allow the human experience and all its ambiguity and hardship to kind of allow us to see resources for wisdom and growth and resiliency, then I think the neurotic flight from sadness, or the neurotic flight from our own suffering and pain, is going to rob us of some virtues and some goods. And I think people who experience disabilities are prophets here, because they are people that are acquiring virtues and insights and gifts of wisdom and resiliency that can be great teachers to a culture that has run from, through a variety of denial mechanisms, run from experiences that would have given them those resources as well. So that's not to say that there's a quick happy ending there. I'm just saying that there are things in the human experience, like, I mean, just even think about heroic stories that we were drawn to in literature or movies. We kind of know that there's got to be a journey, kind of the dark night of the soul, that must be endured for us to become fully human. And that if we never encounter any sort of problem or suffering, then life stays in a fairly like saccharine, cotton candy, untroubled kind of superficiality. So that's just one thing I think about, where when we look at the shadow side of, that there are capacities in the human experience that come, that are only gained through those shadows. Mm-hmm. Now, it's easy to say if you're not the one suffering, but I do think that those who have suffered intensely are the greatest witnesses into the very depth of human experience, right? They're the great cartographers of the soul. Mm-hmm. That bring a wisdom into view that would not otherwise be there.
Yeah. And I think it would be important to articulate that when we speak of suffering, it is not necessarily a suffering of the individual either. It's a suffering created by a social setting as well. I know back when we were talking about defining disability, one of the things that I often try to balance with the community is that someone like Amy Kenny, who wrote her book, My Body is Not a Prayer Request. The idea and the defense is that I was born this way. And so God created me this way. It's not necessarily a state of suffering. It's who I am. I am disabled as opposed to I have a disability. And then I remember arguing with her about this a bit online one time, in the sense that I can understand that, but there's a bit of a mystery as to that framework, because not all of us were born this way. I was in a car accident in 1994 with a spinal cord injury.
Uh-huh.
So I don't think God intended me to necessarily be created with paralysis. And I don't think he was necessarily behind the reasoning of my car accident. I think there were other forces involved. So in sharing that, what I'm wondering is it fair to frame the resurrected state we are moving towards in life as being a state of wonder, rather than, Jesus doesn't spend a lot of his time talking about what you'll be like when you are in heaven, but rather what you live your life as now. And leaving the state of resurrection into the hands of God. Give unto God what is God's, give unto life or Caesar what is Caesar's, and frame it as a state of wonder. I don't know if that's a healthy framework, but it's what I thought of.
I bumped into, and I'm not enough of a Dante scholar to know if I'm getting this quite right, but in Dante's Divine Comedy, in the way he describes paradise, most people know Inferno, but the paradise is the third part. And in the paradise, he does describe people kind of reaching different eternal ends. And so I do think one of maybe the problems that we have in envisioning the afterlife is that there is a way it's going to be. Okay. There's like one way it's going to be. So everybody who cannot walk in this life, who's in a wheelchair, shall walk. That's just the way it's going to be. And so I wonder if it might be helpful to allow for a diversity of visions, right? So there may be somebody that they're what they would consider bliss is to be able to walk and run again, because they are experiencing their disability as a loss or a deficit. However, what was the name of the lady you're describing that you got in an argument with? Her first name?
Amy Kenny.
But for maybe Amy, there is a vision of bliss where her resurrected body is the body that she was created with, but in a qualitatively better form, not overcome, like changed, but there may be enough room in God's providence and graciousness that our blessedness isn't one size fits all, but that all creatures, and this is kind of where Dante goes, all creatures, wherever they end up, will call their lives holy graced, holy blessed. And so I think it's okay to let the eschatological visions of the disabled community to kind of find their own places and not adjudicate how heaven is going to be. I do think there isn't a one size fits all. God will bring us all to a state where we will cry out in praise, thank you for where I've reached. And that can look differently for, I think, different people.
Yeah. Well, we're starting to kind of make the turn towards the shape of joy. That was a good little frame, I thought. So, I'd like to share some of the things I've been gleaning from your thoughts in your book there.
Sure.
Chapter 3. Yeah, chapter 3, you mentioned when you play these games of status, success, and significance, you measure winning and losing by what psychologists call upward and downward social comparison, feelings of snobbery, superiority, and vanity. Winning, our hero game, which you mentioned earlier as well, flow out of downward social comparison as we look down on those beneath our level of attainment. Feeling of losing or hero game involves emotions of envy and jealousy, judgments of upward social comparison, the resentment and shame we feel witnessing the success of others. if all this sounds like a miserable way to go through life, it is. But hero games are our addiction. Status is a drug. And I remember kind of riffing off of you on this on my socials for a bit from the disabled side. And I wrote some notes down there. But I'm going to try and shorten them here in just the thought. One of the ways that as a disabled person I've encountered this hero game is the experience of the greater community, those without disabilities, where there's kind of two ways they go about it. Either they see the disabled, and this is in the church too, as the people in need of service, in the need of their benefit, if you will, and it raises their status even more to serve that community of the disabled. But it's not really much of an equality that goes on there. And there's a lot of resistance to that. I'm going to tell you a little short story. We have a middle school in behind us, and the kids all run around the park for phys ed on beautiful days like today. And we can see them, hundreds of kids running around, and it's great seeing them out there. But the other day, during the end of the school day, I went out for a bit of a wheel, 2 kilometers, and I just took a little leisure stroll. It's the first one after the Canadian winters. And I was rounding down around the school side, and all the kids were coming out. And as I was wheeling by, there was this young girl passing me by, and she's like, "Ooh," pointing at, "Ooh," because I'm out and wheeling. I'm not quite sure what the excitement was over. I got home and I said to my wife, who for our listeners and for you as well, is also in a wheelchair from a spinal cord injury. I said, I think we have to start going out on our back deck when they're doing their laps and cheering them on. I think that's what they're looking for. But some of that kind of hero experience, I guess. But there's also the internal side from the disabled life, where even though we've experienced loss of spinal cord injuries, a bit of a confession, and I'm not saying this is the healthiest, this isn't right, if you will, but we still feel that compulsion to be more, to be better than what our limitations and abilities are. We try to distance ourselves from those we see as having greater disabilities than ourselves. Or we put harm, go as far as harm on ourselves, putting implants in our bodies so that electrical stimulation will make our legs do things that we want them to do. And my wife and I see this, and we've both been in chairs for over 30 years. And the greatest fear is, my God, what happens in 10 years with those implants? What are they going to go through when those things begin to break down? And, this is all in the pursuit of that hero game that you spoke of. So I guess the question I'm framing is, how does this definition protect joy from becoming inspirational fluff or ableism? If you make the argument that joy is not the absence of suffering, but a particular posture towards that reality.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing all of that. So, one of the things I'm trying to talk about in the shape of joy is just kind of trying to do a little autopsy of kind of like our current mental health crisis and what is going on, what is so undermined and fragilized our mental health, and where might we find resources for a little bit more resilient joy. And so that conversation about the hero game is, I do think one of the reasons our mental health has been fragilized is because we're trying to pursue mental health through self-regard. And that self-regard typically is attached to some sort of, I use the word game, but it's a system of meaning. And a lot of those systems of meaning tend to create hierarchies or comparisons. We were talking about that earlier with the accuser being kind of a comparison, that there is some vision I'm chasing. And then if I hit that mark, I'm feeling great. But if I fail to get there, then I'm experiencing a lot of inferiority or inadequacy. And how that's just, as I said, just a really exhausting game because we're constantly in a feedback loop. We're either winning or we're losing. So if you're winning, you're dealing with downward comparison. You're looking down and you're gaining a sense of self-esteem through, well, I'm glad I'm not like those people. But if you're losing, you're looking up at the winners and feeling that sense of loss or inadequacy. And I, again, you pretty profoundly described kind of how even in disability discourse or in how churches engage with the disabled, create versions of that game. And so that's kind of the dead end because of how contingent and conditional that game is. Then what have we learned in the last 30 years of positive psychology research? And that's kind of where I turn towards the research in psychology on meaning in life. That people who live meaningful lives, they experience coherence. Their lives make sense to them. They have a solid story, purpose. They have a reason, larger life goal, but also cosmic or existential significance, what psychologists would call mattering, that their story matters. And it's easy to say that descriptively, that's people who are well-adjusted have those things. But it definitely puts out in front of us kind of where we need to go rather than from this performance in a hero game to settling into a sense of cosmic significance is the journey. But I also think it's one of the things that explains why spirituality and religion and people who are involved in religious communities do experience better mental health, because I do think they have resources, available to where when they experience desolation or failure, they do have places they can go spiritually and mentally and socially to say, my narrative isn't just reducible to my disability, that I have a calling, I have things to be grateful for, I have a story, purpose, and significance that transcends for your example, that transcends my injury, that my story is bigger than an event that happened to me 30 some years ago. That's a huge piece of it. Right. But when I talk to Eric, I'm just not talking to somebody who's experienced a spinal cord injury. That doesn't exhaust your story. Your story isn't limited to that. Now, it's a huge part of your story, no doubt. But and so I describe it that's how I talk about my students. We have to work when we're talking about joy. We have to work to make sure our stories are big enough to carry us through life and not get too small. And I think that's what has happened with a lot of us. Our stories kind of get too small, and because of that, becomes contingent and therefore unsteady and destabilizing.
I'm going to draw a little bit of a picture here from a Canadian perspective, and I'm betting it can reflect somewhat down in the US as well. As you mentioned, disabled people can tend to be the prophetic presence in our society. And I got to admit, I'm a bit of a Jeremiah. I weep and I'm a bit of the pessimist when it comes towards the church. As you said, I'm more than just my spinal cord injury. To give you a bit of history backdrop, when we met in 2014, I was involved in house church ministry activities. My focus and my language was shaped by kind of the missional walk and the missional movement. And that was kind of the larger part of my life, was in that kind of ministry activity. People had often tried to, talking about that hero game before, push me into that role of, well, you're in a wheelchair, you'd be great to start a disabled ministry. And I totally threw that out. And I don't need that. That's not who I am. I'm more than that. And I don't want to be engaged in that. But in the same avenue as I journey, and as Bonnie and I went through some pretty life-altering events in 2021, it was in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we had experienced some significant loss in our own abilities. Disabled became more of a prevalent awakening for me, as I framed and talked about this the other day with the New Leaf crew. Prior to this, disability was kind of in my subconscious, whereas now disability has become a very conscious awareness state. And one of the things I've recognized is that the church, I'm going to maybe put myself in some hot water, but the church has failed to give a adequate and proper representation of the gospel, of a good news, of a transcendent story of discipleship for the disabled in our community. Calgary and Alberta has about 27%, nearly 30% of the population is considered disabled. And yet they say only, about 84% of Christian believers with disabilities actually, do not attend church. They do not attend community. So recently I came across this part of your book where you say the curvature of the self needs to be inverted and reversed. In the words of Augustine, instead of being incurvatus and say curved inward on ourselves, we become excurvatus, say curved outward. The science of awe has pointed the way. We leave the shadowy cave of the modern self with all its chattering, anxious noise to stand dazzled and amazed at something outside of ourselves. But if that is so, we quickly face a pressing, burning question. What lies beyond the cave? Is there a reality and truth to be found outside ourselves? What are we turning toward when we turn away from ourselves? And I think one of the things that I was really picking up on there, and this might be a bit of a pessimistic view of the church, is, correct me if you think I'm wrong, Richard, but a lot of disabled people are feeling like they are tired of the shadows of the puppets being cast on the walls of Socrates' cave, as you were describing, and have been turned outwards, not only in choice, but also in being pushed out by the church as one of those dangerous advocating roles. And we are left with those questions. As someone who's existed on the outside, I see some of the blessings and joys, freedoms of it. But there is still that fear of what lies beyond. We need to encounter that transcendent story. So if disabled followers of Jesus fail to find belonging in the church, or maybe relevance, how might they find courage, hope, and joy in discipleship and faith outside of the church today? I imagine that's probably a pretty heavy question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's been something we have been talking about from the very beginning, about how there is a sense where religion is religion has its sunlight and its shadows, right? So there is a sense where religion can come, like we said, we described how religion can sacralize and enshrine the youthfulness and the vigor and the success. And you see this like in the prosperity gospel space, right? And then we also talked about people quickly, perhaps even defensively, reaching for heaven, where, you're positing very quickly about a heaven where you can walk again, and rushing over your lived experience. Or finally here at the end of this conversation, you speaking to a church that has not been hospitable to or listened to the prophetic speech of a marginalized community. So there's all this sense where religion can go wrong. But I do think, in a certain sense, that the true church, or the authentic church, it is hard to find. It's something that has to be fought for because of all of these pressures that we're talking about, where people don't want to have or experience discomfort. Earlier, I was talking about how, we've lacked tolerances for discomfort. And if somebody's speech or presence or body or experience or story is discomforting, we don't want to hear it. And so there's a kind of fragility there. So like in America, we talk about white fragility. We don't want to hear Black stories because, that's too unsettling. Well, maybe there's an ableism fragility, where stories of the disabled community they make me feel uncomfortable, and they might cause me to think about my duties and obligations a little bit differently. So it's just easier to just kind of walk away. And that's frustrating and dismaying. And yeah, the church is pretty much a dumpster fire in many places. And yet, when we do see people extending care and people are being authentically themselves, and we are making room for each other and all of those differences, that something of heaven on earth is in our midst. But you're right. It is something that is not common, but I think it's an experience worth fighting for. And we do see glimpses of it here as well on earth. And so all that to say is, I do think you, the disabled community, function to point us toward that horizon that we're all trying to chase. And Jesus, when he described his ministry, it's the sower sowing the seed. Most of that soil was unfruitful. So there is a sort of waste that is experienced there. But there are places where it grows. And I think that's what we're all searching for, is that minority place where good things, generous things grow. But yeah, there's a lot of churches that are hard soil, thorny soils, rocky soil, and the word doesn't really grow there. It atrophies and it dies. So all that to say is, I think in the prophetic experience of the disabled community, there are hopeful signs and horizons of possibility that is calling the church to be her better self, her truer self.
Yeah, that's cool. I was thinking of closing in on some of your words from 1 Corinthians 15, where, "O death is your victory, where, O death is your sting." The gospel does not deny death. It names it, faces it, and then robs it of its power. But I was also connecting during your talk there, the reality that the authentic church is out there, and it's for us to experience, enjoy, fight the good fight, as Paul said to Timothy. And I think we can do that. We band together, we find one another, we take that outward curve. And I am so thankful for the many tools in which you've given me throughout some of my journey, and I'm hoping I can share with others in my community of not only not being cast in the fear of death, but also experiencing the shape of joy in the outward fashion. And looking forward to hearing how love can also impact the way the scriptures come alive and speak new truths to me and my community amongst disabled and otherwise abled. So thank you, Richard, for joining me today at the bottom of the well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. It's been a lovely conversation, and you've pushed me to think in ways and to experience things that I have been given a gift as well. So the gratitude's mutual.
Awesome. I look forward to our next encounter.
Okay, looking forward to it.